afternoon. So most of you know who I am. My name is Emily Spieler, and I'm the dean of this wonderful law school. And it's my honor to welcome all of you to the Carol and Richard Daynard Public Interest Visiting Fellow Community Lecture. So a little bit about the program and then a little bit about our speaker. This Public Interest Visiting Fellow program for practicing lawyers is now in its 7th year. We realize that this is no longer a new program. It's now part of the deep and important tradition of commitment of this law school to public interest law, to understanding what lawyers do to advance the public good. The fellows who have been selected are carrying good news back to their home communities about this law school, and they've all gone on to ever greater accomplishments. For all of this, we owe a debt of gratitude to the people who made this new part of our traditions possible. Carol and Richard Daynard. Dick, are you here? Okay. Carol here? So, Dick joined the faculty of the School of Law in 1969. He was a teacher and a scholar, but perhaps more importantly, Dick has always believed that law and perseverance can, in fact, change the world. He's now an international leader in the world, which he, in fact, changed, having had a big hand in the remarkable turnaround in public opinion and personal behavior in tobacco use. Dick believes, as I do, in the power of law to change the world, and he has brought his success full circle. This Visiting Fellows program represents a combination of devotion to this law school and to the promise we hold out to train lawyers who can change the world. This dual commitment, which he shares with his wife, Carol, led the Daynards give us a gift, and thus this Public Interest Visiting Fellows program was born in 2005. We award 2 attorneys each year this fellowship to honor their work and to celebrate the importance of the strategic use of law to promote the public good. Our goal in this program is to provide our students with role models who use their legal skills effectively and creatively, and in Carlos's case, bravely, to make the world a better place. We invite 2 practitioners each year to visit the school for 3 days each. And during these 3-day visits, we ask the fellow to deliver a lecture like the one you'll hear today, as well as meeting with students, speaking in classes, talking to people in the career services and co-op offices, and so on, and spending some time individually with both faculty and students. A faculty, staff, student committee selects the fellows, and we decided to bring 1 alumnus or alumni each year, and 1 person who is not a graduate of this law school. And our ability to carry this program forward really rests on the hard work of a lot of people in this community. Just to give you an idea of the depth and breadth of our visitors, Patricia Guerin was here earlier this academic year. She's an indefatigable criminal defense and civil rights lawyer who practices here in Boston. In prior years, Fred Brewington was here, sometimes called the Thurgood Marshall of Long Island. Sujatha Baliga, director at Community Justice Works. Monica Hallis, a determined advocate for low-wage workers, again here in Boston at GBLS. Bill Quigley, a poverty and civil rights strategist at Loyola University. Christina DiConcini, a nationally known advocate in the field of immigration law. Michael Ratner, president of Center for Constitutional Rights. Judy Scott, general counsel to the Service Employees International Union. James Bell, founder and executive director of the Hayward Burns Institute. Mary Bonato, also called Thurgood Marshall, of the gay rights movement by the New York Times, and as most of you know, here in Boston, and was the lead lawyer on Goodrich. So the list goes on, and they are all remarkable people who have gone on to do even more remarkable things. Of course, this kind of program can't go on without support behind the scenes by a lot of people. In particular, Janice Galligan, Cindy Niven, Spector, head up the administrative support, and Lucy Williams has chaired the student faculty committee for the last several years that makes the selection. And I'm the one who gets but first, A round of applause for Lucy's work, the committee's work, and the staff who work on this. I'm the one who gets the email from Lucy as chair of the committee saying, okay, it's time for you to make a phone call, and these are among the most fun phone calls I make in the course of my year, to call people up and tell them that our community has selected someone to do this. So today we welcome Carlos Spector as our 14th Daynard Public Interest Visiting Fellow. And so first, a bit of background. Since 2006, 60,000 people have been killed as the result of drug-related violence in Mexico. It's estimated that another 230,000 have been displaced. Approximately half of them have fled to the U.S. Ciudad Juarez, located across the border from El Paso, Texas, has emerged as Mexico's most violent city. An estimated 30,000 Mexican nationals fleeing the violence in Ciudad Juarez have settled in El Paso since 2008, where Carlos practices law. And a growing number of these refugees are petitioning for asylum, seeking protection from the U.S. government. Carlos is an incredibly respected immigration attorney in El Paso. He was born there and has spent much of his life there in the neighboring city of Ciudad Juarez. He has been vocal and courageous in addressing the human toll of the drug war, focusing in particular on the human rights abuses committed by the Mexican military and on the issues of detention and asylum here in the U.S. On the border, he's known as the attorney who has the guts to say what everyone else is fearful of saying out loud, especially with regard to corruption within the Mexican military and government. His work has been covered in the media. I know this because I spent some time Googling yesterday, from Mother Jones to the Washington Post, NPR, to more local papers like the El Paso Times. He's won several landmark asylum cases. He successfully represented journalists, including Alejandro Hernandez Pacheco and Emilio Gutierrez Soto, human rights activists, and Monica Arias Hernandez, daughter-in-law of slain Mexican activist Escobedo. There are legal and political challenges to success in this field, as there are in many of the fields that require us to challenge existing power structures. But the work that Carlos does not only requires strategic legal thinking and moral commitment, it requires immense personal courage. Carlos has demonstrated all of these in his work. So we welcome you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Can you hear me? Is the mic on? Can you hear me? Yes or no? Okay, thank you. Okay, I want to thank the dean and the committee and the school for honoring me and my family. I've had my wife, who's been involved in these battles with me over the last 20 years, as well as my daughter, who's a student at UT Austin, and searching for her own path. Also to Mr. Daynard, to give us the ability, and as practicing attorneys, to get away from our practice. It's really difficult to see what we're doing when we're doing it. And we arrived Friday, and I've had the ability to just reflect a little on what we're doing. And sometimes we get lost. And I've had a little opportunity the last couple of weeks to do a little reading. And the first 5 minutes or so, I want to deal, and it's an effort on my part to take advantage of this forum and this school which highlights and elevates the marriage of theory and practice. And when you're involved in practice, you miss the theory. When you're doing the theory, you miss the practice. And so, first 5 minutes, I'm going to try to look a little at the colonial legal history of Mexico, because the most important thing in any political asylum case is the political social context. This is Mexican political asylum. So beyond the anecdotal discussion that we will be having with the cases that are really profoundly disturbing, and we're discussing the law that applies to the facts, I want to give you a little historical context into the institutionalized corruption within Mexican society that has characterized it. And And bear with me because this is the first time I articulate these particular findings and thoughts. And time and progress have not modified the Mexican environment beyond the context of its colonial history. One of the books I read ended the book with that Mexico's colonial legacy lives on. And to understand the Mexican colonial legacy, we have to understand that there were three entities that brought the New World to Mexico: the sword, the cross, and el letrado, the lawyer. And the law and the legal system to enforce the conquering rules and customs brought by Spain were essential to understanding the context. The Spanish or Iberian legal tradition is founded in Roman rule, and Roman rule was characterized by having this agility, this ability to incorporate the laws and customs of the conquered people, with two exceptions: commercial and civil rule. That was part of the Roman Empire. Thereafter, with the Romans and the Visigoths, the Germans, and 700 years of Moorish rule in Spain, they followed the same tradition of allowing the local peoples to rule conflicts, to engage in the resolution of conflicts. We don't care what you guys do amongst yourselves, so long as we control the economic interest, was essentially what governed centuries of Spanish rule, Roman rule, and rule in the New World. Now, during the 700 years of Moorish rule, from around 700 to 1400 in Spain, the various entities and municipalities in Spain that were seeking to reconquer Spain basically had home rule with the municipalities. But it wasn't until 1252 with Alfonso el Sabio, the Wise, who incorporated the small entities into one big brotherhood of law enforcement called La Santa Hermandad, the Holy Brotherhood. And it was basically this Holy Brotherhood that began to consolidate the Spanish crown and legal rule. And the first things they did was to create las salas de civiles y criminales, which was basically civil and criminal court that responded exclusively to the royal crown. Now, when the Spanish enter the New World, and this is something that really marks the difference between American colonies that brought families and were fleeing to a large part persecution, especially religious persecution, versus the intent of the Spanish conquerors to plunder and pillage the New World. So the Spanish conquistadores who came alone without families thought, or actually were allowed to view their conquest as a private conquest that entitled them to pillage, to political and economic benefits. But one of the first things that Cortés did is set up a system called encomiendas, which is a grant, where they would allow the Spanish to be assigned tributary Indians, which meant I'd get my Indians who either paid me in kind or with labor. And it was this system that began to worry the crown in terms of creating feudal lords that weren't dependent upon the crown. And so almost immediately, 10 years after the conquistadores began, the royal crown comes in with a system called corregidores, which in Spanish corregir means to correct. And the Spanish crown was, again, very agile, able to incorporate the encomiendas into a system called corregidores, wherein they appoint a viceroy. And it was the first time in the New World there was a viceroy that basically resolved all conflicts in the name of the crown. So we see from the beginning a highly centralized authority within the judiciary. Now, but it was several hundred years later where the viceroys in the 1700s are incapable of really ruling or enforcing the chaos that existed in the New World, and they developed really the first colonial structure of justice, which is the acordada, which in Spanish means the agreement. And there was an agreement where for the first time there would be a series of judges throughout the territories that would be assigned to enforce their rule with unlimited jurisdiction. Prior to the acordada, there was still home rule and there was still limited jurisdiction. But with the acordada, we had for the first time a judicial branch that was both an executive branch as well, in as much as it allowed itself unlimited authority and had the ability to sentence without prior approval from the crown. And so these were major developments in the New World that really sets the context for what we have today, which is a highly arbitrary and capricious system of authority that is highly decentralized, which gives a lot of authority to the local communities. And that brings us to, I think, to the slides here in terms of the context. And these are also just some key dates. For 1599, Cortés arrives. 1810 is the War of Independence, Father Hidalgo. This is a conservative revolution, wherein a nationalist revolution, where the Mexicans seek to replace the Spaniards as those in control of the national resources. And of course, we have the Mexican Revolution in 1910. It's important to understand between 1825 and 1870, and there was 800 revolts in Mexico. And the legal system, of course, was unable to resolve those conflicts, much less mete out justice. And so we have the Mexican Revolution in 1910 that really brings and ushers a new period into Mexican history, which is the revolutionary institutional party, the PRI. This party outlives the Bolsheviks as the longest living party in the universe. Yeah, which really spoke to the genius of that party and the sophistication to keep power in one central authority. Now that is lost in 2000 with the election of Fox, which is the first Panista party, which would be their Republican Party, and is currently controlled by Calderón, who won in 2006. Now, let me go back. Now, in 2006, Calderón becomes the second Panista president of Mexico, and wins amidst widespread claims of fraud. Wins by less than, I think, 0.5% of the vote. And his initial instincts told him he had to consolidate power by bringing in the military, making them an essential player in the life of Mexico. Prior to this, the one institution in Mexico that was trusted the most, in spite of a fairly bad reputation was the Mexican army. That was viewed as the one institution that could bring stability to Mexico and was the most trusted within the country. And they had never been released from the barracks, other than for occasional civil wars, attacks against guerrillas in the mountains or in the jungles, or for natural disasters. And so what Calderón does is he unleashes the army throughout the country. And in 2008, he's elected in 2006, 2008, Calderón begins a war on the drug cartels with support from the Plan Mérida. The result was widespread violence throughout the country. And these are essentially the murder statistics for Ciudad Juárez over the last couple of years. The total murders between 2007 and 11 has been over 10,000, and approximate numbers are over 50,000. That's a genocide in many countries. And the explanation of these murders by the Mexican government is that, in fact, all of these murders are somehow related to the drug cartels. What our work reveals, and the heart and the essence of what we're trying to do, is to demystify this position of the Mexican government and the U.S. government, is that these are drug cartel murders, that these are drug related. We have to define what constitutes drug related. And our position in all of our cases show, and every time we win a case, we cite the Mexican government as the primary persecutor in all of our cases. Now, this is a map of Chihuahua, and this is an actual exhibit that we are using in several cases before USCIS, affirmative asylum claims, and I'll get a little into that. Now, in March of 2008, the Mexican government comes up north with a program called Conjunto Chihuahua, which means in conjunction with Chihuahua, the state of Chihuahua. It's the largest state in Mexico, and here's Juárez, and we live in El Paso. And so the very first asylum case we get is Emilio Gutierrez Soto. He's a reporter from Ascensión, Chihuahua, a Mayberry town. He's not a big reporter. It's like living in Mayberry. Everybody knows each other, and Ascensión is right here. Now, March of 2008, the Mexican military comes north. And they go looking for Emilio because in 2005, he wrote a series of articles critical of the Mexican armies pilfering people's homes, going in and taking food off their plates, taking food out of the refrigerators, stealing jewelries from stores and food from restaurants. He wrote an article in 2005. They beat him up, and he filed a criminal complaint and a human rights report. And he's pretty much left alone. But when they come up in March of 2008, they arrest him. At the very moment that they're arresting him, the U.S. government is giving the Mexican government millions and millions of dollars pursuant to the Mérida Plan. So we have this little small town reporter, maybe with like a 7th grade education, becoming an international figure because the worst thing happened for both countries. At the very moment that the U.S. is sending funds to the Mexican military, we have an incident which highlights the repression of the Mexican press by the Mexican military. Worst facts possible for the U.S. government. So what does Emilio do when they come to his house and they threaten him with death again? He flees to New Mexico, to Antelope Wells, New Mexico, with his 13-year-old son, and is arrested by the U.S. government. And when he's arrested by the U.S. government, he's taken to an immigration camp in El Paso, Texas, where they refuse to release him. He's held for 7 months, and it took an international campaign to release him in conjunction with the Paris-based Reporters Without Borders. And so part of the process of people fleeing Mexico, when the Mexican military comes, the U.S. government's response was to lock them up. So we had hundreds of people seeking asylum, and the policy under the Bush administration was prolonged detention, and it worked. Most people would stay 2-3 months and leave. But he decided to fight it because he truly felt that he was going to be killed by the Mexican military, and there was a nationwide fear of returning. So as a result of that, we start developing a series we're doing some research, and Sandra, my wife, I said, well, why don't you see if you can find some cases that show what's happening from the newspaper articles. And so she gets into it and starts finding out that there's a pattern of human rights abuses resulting upon as the Mexican military comes. But what really brought that to mind was that, again, he's arrested in 2008, what he did in 2005. In Juarez, we have a friend, Cipriana Jurado, a small little woman like this who started off as an organizer in the Maquilas, who's a brave woman who spent her time in the Mexican prisons looking for the disappeared. So that didn't make her a favorite daughter of the army during that period. And at the very same time that Emilio is getting arrested, they're arresting her. And they're arresting her because in 2005, she shut the international bridge with a protest. So it was too much of a coincidence at that point to say that they're looking at people's past activity to engage in present repression and repression in the present. So that's why we started looking at the articles. And what we found, what Sandra found calling through the newspaper articles, is that from 2008 to 2010, the federal government or the Mexican military murdered 21 human rights activists. And those are represented, these are their names, and these are in purple. These are human rights activists and or family members that were killed, and the number has gone up. So we immediately said and felt that what we had is an ideological cleansing of the North by the Mexican military. Has nothing to do with drugs. And so it's taking the opportunity, the Mexican government is taking the opportunity to silence dissent. And they've done this historically over the years. And so we have filed, so then based with this information, we filed the asylum claim for Emilio, and we filed the asylum claim for Cipriana. When you file an asylum claim, it depends how you present it where you go. If you enter lawfully, like Cipriana did, you file it affirmatively, which means you file it with USCIS, the government, and you're not detained, and it's with an officer, and it's non-confrontational, and we've already won Cipriana's case, okay, within a couple of months. Emilio, we've had the case since 2009. He will be having his first hearing on in May 2012. We have one judge in El Paso. You have the detained and the non-detained docket. We have one judge in the non-detained docket, 3 in the immigration camp, and it's taking 3 years to get your first hearing. So if we go to an immigration judge with Emilio, as we're going, we won't have our final hearing. You don't have your final hearing or the beginning of your final hearing for 4 years. Okay? And after 4 years, we get 4 hours to present our case. A murderer will get 3 months consecutively to present his case. Someone fleeing for his life gets 4 hours. So what I'm trying to do is intertwine also the reaction of the government and the procedural and bureaucratic maneuvering to discourage asylum claims, especially with Mexican asylum claims. So with Emilio, we're faced with the decision, I can't finish his case in 40 hours. I can't do 20 hours on direct. I can only do direct probably in 20 hours. But we have the major human rights organizations and newspaper organizations on both sides of the border willing and able to testify. That takes time. So then, in May we begin it, we present 4 hours, and then the next year they'll give us another 4 hours. And so this is part of the process of denying cases, because ultimately people withdraw or abandon their case. And of course it's viewed as frivolous because you didn't pursue it. And so during this whole process in Chihuahua, which is just one of 32 states in Mexico, but I think this gives you an idea, just to go through this briefly, is that the orange are chiefs of police and leaders of investigative task force. The red is the PRD, which is the leftist party. The green is the PRI, which is out of power. And the blue is the PAN, the party in power. And so this gives you an idea of the nature of the political murders. One of the leading newspapers in Mexico is Excelsior, and they came out with an article the other day or a month or so ago doing the most advanced investigative piece in Mexico, and they said there had been 4 political murders in Mexico. You know, and we're not investigative reporters. This is just culling through this informally, you know, or just being aware of what's happening in Mexico on a daily basis. So we have over 100 political murders. When's the last time we've had a political murder here? Okay, but the Mexican government insists that the murders are all drug-induced and that everybody is involved in drug trafficking one way or the other. Now, in order to seek political asylum, it has to be, you have to have, is the issue of asylum new to almost everybody? Or has anybody, let me have a show of hands of those who are familiar, had a course or, okay, at least a third, okay. The standard for asylum says that you must have a well-founded fear of persecution in order to go into another country and seek asylum. And it has to be on account of one of those 5 enumerated grounds: race, religion, nationality, and the last 2 are the most common: membership in a particular social group and political opinion. Okay? Most of our cases are political opinion. Okay? Social group is highly it's a new area of the law, relatively speaking, and with a lot of creativity. I think the possibility exists of carving new grounds out of that. Okay. Now, on the well-founded fear of persecution, you either have to be pursued by the state or a non-governmental actor that the government is unable or willing to protect you from. Okay. Now, of course, the form is the I-589. If you win your asylum claim, you get permanent residency. And you have to file it within a year of coming into the country. And withholding of removal basically just does exactly that. It withholds your removal pending the change of circumstances in your country. This is the definition of refugee. Now, there's another form of asylum which in 25 years I haven't used until just recently. And that's called Humanitarian Asylum. There's a provision in the law that says some human conduct is so heinous in per se that we will grant you asylum even if you're not being persecuted on one of the enumerated grounds. 6 weeks ago, a mother comes to the office crying that her son wants asylum. He's 33 years old. He has been in business in Chihuahua, the city of Chihuahua, the capital, for 11 years, selling Canadian potato chips and sodas at events, doing very well. And so one day, some people come and visit him and tell him, you need to give us $10,000. This is maybe back in November. He pays it. It's a credible threat. They know where his 2 kids and wife live and work, go to school. Pays it. 3 months later, again, another 10. He pays it. Third time, can't pay it. So they come to his house, he's outside, and they shoot him in the foot. They take him to the hospital. Comes out a week later, and as he's walking around, they say, you got to pay us again. So they take him to a park in midday and slice his feet off. Taliban stuff. Okay? Who did it? The cartels? No. The police. The Chihuahua State Police. We have their names. We know who they are. He's known them with 2 witnesses. That's how brazen the corruption is. So we're seeking asylum on the basis of humanitarian asylum. He still has family there, and he's afraid and doesn't want to make public noise at this point. But that shows you the extent of the corruption and the violence in Mexico that has nothing to do with the drug trafficking. It's a pretext. Prior to this incident, I thought nothing could shake me. This shook us collectively at the office and in the city, of those of us who know of the incident, that the state is no longer using the cartels as frontmen. They're doing it themselves. Why do I need to use a thug if I have to give him money? It's all a question of money and corruption. And so we're at a situation where the family member, the individual who we take to the bridge, they cut his ankles with a machete, completely awake, and then in the hospital they have to cut it under the knee so the prosthesis can be taken care of in the future. He's walking now. It's an amazing story, but he's walking. Now, his family's in Mexico, and they may or may not seek asylum. But if they do seek asylum, on what basis would we do it? And I'm using these cases not just anecdotally, but for the purposes of legal analysis. There was no opinion. These are the most difficult cases. Extortion, which is rampant. The thugs and the impunity is so widespread in Mexico and in Juarez that they charge you to live in your house. You've heard of carjackings? They have housejackings on a daily basis. Okay? And there's absolute impunity in Mexico. And that goes to the unable or unwilling to protect you. But extortion, historically in asylum law, has been very unsuccessful. Because the question is, why did they extort you? Because they're criminals. They didn't do it because of your race, your religion, etc. And so that's going to be difficult. So the question comes or arises on this case of the young man who had his feet sliced. If his family wants to come, then family is a social group. Remember the 5 grounds, particular social group. Family has been defined as a particular social group. If the family came, we would probably try to piggyback them in that asylum claim on the basis of family. Definition of persecution very quickly. To establish persecution, an applicant must prove that the harm he or she experienced was inflicted by the government or an entity the government was unable or unwilling to control. And there's a long list of cases, and I'll be showing you those briefly, that deal with that element. We've got to show that the government is unable or unwilling to control the non-governmental actor. And I don't think that's very difficult to do in most of these cases. But one of the things that we've been doing on the border that I think is counterintuitive to what most asylum attorneys do is encouraging political opinion. Okay? You are persecuted in Mexico. You are run out of your house. You are extorted. I'm talking about someone who's been extorted. They take away your families, your friends, your country, and they still want you to be quiet. So when they come to us on cases that don't qualify, I give them a pep talk about the First Amendment. You are now in the United States, and you have a right to criticize your government. So there's nothing to preclude or nothing to be ashamed of denouncing the Mexican government from here. The judges berate me and my clients and say, well, but for your counseling of them, they wouldn't be talking. No, but for the threats in Mexico, they wouldn't be talking. Now I'm the one that's responsible. He says, I am proud to stand by them in public and have them denounce the Mexican government. Why? Because you're now in the United States. Now you can do it. Why didn't you do it over there? Because they'd kill me. And so that's political opinion. So cases that don't necessarily fall into one of those categories doesn't mean that when you leave it, it doesn't qualify as such. A woman comes in 2 days ago. She's very humbly dressed, could be a house cleaner. She says, I'm thinking about political asylum. I said, well, tell me what happened. She said, well, I own a mall. She owns a mall. That was part of her shtick, to walk around like a maid. She says, I got 30 employees. I own a meat market and a big mall. They killed my husband last year. They kidnapped him, and my daughter 2 weeks ago. I said, well, that doesn't qualify. Yeah, I can't do anything for you because why did they do it? They wanted money. Okay, they extorted you. And I told them, well, we got a group of Mexicans in exile. If you came out and had participated and wanted to denounce it, that'd be one way of doing it. I says, how about, did you file police reports? Yes. Are there articles in the newspapers? Yes. You got the death certificates? Yes. I said, did you file a human rights report? He goes, yes, we talked to the main guy. And this is an example of the pervasiveness of corruption and an insight into Mexican society that kind of even shook me. They go to someone I thought was a friend who heads up a major human rights organization. And I said, well, did you talk to so-and-so, the guy that represents the state? And he goes, yes. What'd he say? He says, for $14,000, he could find my husband. Okay? This is the human rights guy who, if my daughter was kidnapped in Juarez, I would go to. Because that's the nature. He's negotiated with the various entities. Now, this individual, I want to make 2 points with this. One is the nature of her claim, which we'll get back to in terms of, well, let me address that first. The nature of her claim could be social group or political opinion if she came and spoke out. But the problem that we have in terms of the corruption, and it gives me an opportunity to show the different levels of corruption in Mexico in terms of the difficulties of an asylum claim in life in Mexico, is that every level of government in Mexico is tied to a cartel. Each level of government has its cartel. The Mexican government, essentially Chapo Guzman, the Sinaloa cartel. You know, La Línea, which was the one in Chihuahua, up until recently was run and affiliated with the state government and the local government of Chihuahua. But the Chapo Guzman cartel, which is the favorite of the military, has taken over. In March of 2008, when all this begins as well, this leader, state leader of human rights, was filing complaints against the Mexican military. They run him out of the country and they lock him up in an immigration camp in El Paso. We get him out. And the reason why it's kind of a very funny border story is that they ask him at the bridge, because he looks like Santa Claus. He really does. So everybody recognizes him. They ask him at the bridge, "Are you afraid?" And he's irreverent and says, "I'm Mexican. I have to be afraid." Trying to be cute. They arrest him to protect him because he uttered the word fear. And so these bureaucrats who protect our rights at the border locked them up to have a credible fear interview, which could take months being locked up at the camp. So we have to have a campaign to get him out saying he doesn't want asylum. He says, but he's afraid. Yes, but just because you're afraid doesn't mean you want asylum. Everybody in Juarez is afraid. I mean, it was Kafkaesque, you know. And so they wanted us to withdraw the asylum claim, but how can we withdraw something we haven't submitted? Yeah, and so it was nuts. But there's an international scandal because he's fleeing the Mexican military. Everything is negotiable in Mexico. Long story short, after we get him out, Reporters Without Borders, a big international thing, he goes back to Juarez, and all of a sudden he's got like 15 military guys around him. He's like a mobster with 15 guys protecting him. So then ultimately, all of a sudden, he's no longer filing claims against the military, but against the feds and the municipal police. And so it looked strange to us, and we never thought of anything, thought much of it, but that just gives you a sense that, one day you're working for one cartel, the next day you're working for the other cartel. And so when he said $14,000 that he would get paid for that purpose, he was being honest. He would and does do that. But again, what is human rights? What are human rights, and what is corruption and justice in a relative sense? So he's done tremendous work on the other hand. Again, if any one of you were in Mexico got picked up, I would call him because he would have the contacts to negotiate. Because probably with those $14,000, he was probably going to pocket 10 and distribute 4 to the appropriate people, because the most efficient police in the world is the Mexican police. If they want to help. And so I think that gives you a sense of what we're dealing with in Mexico in terms of the violence and the response. And that's why in our practice, we've made the decision, what type of cases do we do? And I think this addresses part of some of the individual questions that I've received that I think are important to address collectively. And that's, what is our role in the public, as lawyers in the private sector, working in the public interest? We're in the 4th poorest city in the country. Okay, there are very few well-funded human rights organizations that do this work or can do the work. There's not New York, there's not San Francisco. Okay, and so what we've been able to do is we've got like 20 pro bono Mexican asylum cases that is funded by our legal work, and we've gotten to the point where we can do that. And I think that since we can't handle it and the thing is only getting worse, is that we've taken the position that we help those who help themselves, and help others, which are basically social activists, human rights activists, and journalists. Now, and that's a big social group that we're working with, is human social activists. 90% of those killed are men in Mexico. 90% of those who seek justice are women. The ones who lead the searches, the ones who give up everything to find their missing children, husbands, spouses, are women. And the most emblematic case that we have that I can share with you is Marisela Escobedo. And everything begins with her, really. Several years ago, Marisela Escobedo, a retired nurse from Juarez, from the Social Security office, retired and opened a little carpentry shop in Juarez. Her daughter was 15, Ruby. Ruby started going out with one of the workers, it was like 22, 23. They elope, keeps her away from her mother, and ultimately kills her and cuts her up into little pieces and throws her into a pigsty. The mother miraculously finds her. She's a nurse, and in the pigsty finds human bones, and it's her daughter. Okay? She takes this to the police, who refuse to prosecute. And she forces them through a series of marches and protests. She becomes a social activist, denouncing the government for not doing anything. And what happened is that they ultimately arrested the guy. She finds the guy in Zacatecas. She, on 3 different occasions, finds him, and on 3 different occasions they failed to arrest him. But she made such an international scandal of this that they ultimately arrested him. Long story short, he's not convicted. They pick him up again. He is convicted and sentenced, and then they let him go. Why? Because they had just adopted the American system of juries and the oral tradition. And to me, this was kind of like an example of changing the historic model that I spoke of earlier. That we had the ability of the conquering countries had the ability of allowing communities to deal with their systems of justice through their laws and their customs. And so this is really the first case in Mexico that tries the jury system, the oral system. And they threw it out because he had confessed in open court, but when they arrested him, it was a bad confession. So it was kind of like law and order type of attitude that they had. They were really unfamiliar with the whole process. But he, in open court, said, "I killed your daughter and I apologize." You know, and of course they didn't want to use the statement, so they let him go. The real reason they let him go is because he's tied to the Zetas in Zacatecas, a major drug trafficking organization that has a history of killing judges. So he's released. He's still out, and we're still looking for him. But Marisela Escobedo doesn't stop there. She begins a state, national hunger strike and a movement that takes her to the doorsteps of the Capitol in Chihuahua. On December 16th of last year, with 10 cameras on the Capitol doorsteps, at the doorsteps, she's murdered. She's assassinated. Okay? We represent the brother and the family, and we've already won one of the cases. But this is the social activist that is appearing in Mexico. These brave women who, if you kill my child, is going to the ends of the world to seek justice. And it's in the seeking of justice that the government is embarrassed. So these are state crimes. Is there a connection to the drug world? Yes, everywhere. But to say that it's essentially a problem that the cartels created, it's the context None of these individuals are ever prosecuted. So we have this one guy that the court system supposedly, it's a theory, was afraid of, and that's why we released him. But the point is that the family has taken the position that this is a state crime. She's murdered in broad daylight. We've gotten 2 cameras. 8 of the other cameras weren't working. You know, I mean, it's just a nightmare. And so this is the context. Another case we have in terms of as an illustration of a social group and a political opinion is probably the 2 most famous cases we have that are emblematic. Is the other one is the Reyes family. The Reyes family is, how much time do we have? Okay. How much time should I leave for questions?
Probably about 15 minutes or so.
Okay, let me do the Reyes family and we'll go through some of the slides. This is Juarez. And next to it is the Valley of Juarez. These are the most dangerous areas in the world, okay? Iraq, Somalia, you name it. My mother, and I grew up in the summers in the Valley of Juarez. My mother's from the Valley of Juarez. And so we've got a personal insight and connection to the murders in this area. All these don't fit there, but this is all the Valley of Juarez. And in that area is a family that we've known and heard about for years, is the Reyes Al-Assad family. They've been involved for many years with the left parties in Mexico. In the 1990s, there was a nuclear Sierra Madre nuclear dump that they wanted to create in Cerro Blanco, Texas, which is not far from Guadalupe and the Juarez border. And everybody protested on the U.S. side, and the Mexican government, pursuant to a treaty, signed that they would allow the nuclear dump because it was 100 miles from the border. And the only community in all of Mexico that actually marched and raised and protested was from Guadalupe. And they got the whole thing overturned. They were on the Mexican government's hit list for many years. So when the Mexican government comes up in 2008, they start not only in the south, but they start ultimately in the north attacking human rights activists. The Reyes Al-Assad family is a family of bakers. And ultimately, the whole repression of the family begins with Josefina Reyes, who was the daughter, one of the oldest daughters. And she too had a history with Cipriana Jurado of being the person in the village you went to if someone was missing. So they were known as troublemakers and as dissidents. But in March, in 2010, her son, who supposedly was involved with the drug guys, they come, they arrest him, and he disappears. Her position was, if he's involved in criminal activity, arrest him, prosecute him. But when she starts looking for him and making noise, they kill her. And that's when Cipriana Jurado flees. Thereafter, they kill one family member, they all protest. We're up to 5 dead brothers and sisters now. And we only have one male left. Saul Reyes Al-Assad leaves her. And that's one of the cases that's pending, and that's on political opinion and social group. But the point I want to make with that is that they fled to Mexico City, and they were going to get asylum with the U.S. consulate. They were being offered asylum by Spain and other countries. But the Mexican government denounced them as being drug traffickers because everybody in Mexico has a friend, a neighbor, a cousin who's somehow related. But because you got a cousin who does crack doesn't mean you're involved with drugs. And these are the tenuous connections they make when they say he was involved in drugs. Yeah, maybe he was using drugs, maybe he was selling it. That's a criminal offense against that individual. And so this is something that characterizes the accusation of drugs. Okay, looking a little into the process. We have in El Paso basically 2 immigration judges that deal with immigration court cases. If you're interested, Syracuse has this track analysis, transnational records analysis of immigration cases, and we have found that the closer the immigration judges are to the border, the higher the denial rate. Okay, you would think it would be the opposite with their familiarity, but here we have Judge Abbott and Judge Revke, who have amongst the highest denial rate in the country. Judge Abbott denies it 74% of the time, and Judge Revke, I believe, what was that? 53% of the time. The national denial rate of Mexican asylum claims is 90%. Just some Mexican asylum statistics. When you see USCIS, that means that's an affirmative grant. That means that's an asylum officer, which is the liberal wing of the government. 2007, we had 103 granted. 2010, 143. This is the court, okay? EOIR, the Executive Office of Immigration Review, in 2010, these are the latest statistics, we had 3,200 received and 49 granted. And we've got like 6 of them. Now, the reason I was going through some of this anecdotal information, look how many are abandoned and withdrawn. Only less than 2% are granted. And we take we view the abandoned and the withdrawn claims as government-induced withdrawals and denials on the basis of some of the facts I was going through. The prolonged detentions, 5 years to get your first hearing, you know, the pressure from the Mexican government. Okay, this I may reserve for the actual class with Rachel. Just finally, just one other legal impediment to asylum cases generally is that you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution based upon one of the 5 enumerated grounds by a governmental actor non-governmental actor that the government is unable or unwilling to protect, or the state. And you have to show that it's a countrywide fear and that there's no reasonable opportunity for internal relocation. Now that internal relocation, if the actor is the state, especially the federal government, then there's a presumption, it's a rebuttable presumption that it is nationwide. And that's one of the, I think, most successful and widespread arguments that the government uses in these cases, and that's that why can't you hide out in Guadalajara? Why can't you go to Mexico City? You know, this is not El Salvador, it's not a small country. So the internal relocation is a major argument that they've used. Okay, I think I'll just finally, I think an interesting note is that from 2003 to 2006, there were 691 complaints against Mexican soldiers, the Army. 691. In the last 3 years, 5,000. And so those statistics bear out this anecdotal information in terms of the increased human rights abuses in Mexico in the war against drugs as a pretext against dissidents and human rights activists. And that's why we as a firm have targeted human rights activists, social activists, and the press as people that deserve the attention, because if you silence them with all our limited resources that we have, then you silence a large part of Mexican society. Thank you.
So much, Carlos. And before I take questions, I just want to remind people that Wednesday, Rachel Rosenberg put together a wonderful roundtable with Carlos, and I didn't bring the other three people's names. Rachel, you want to announce who?
Oh, sure. Carlene Desiree, who is the head of the Association for Extradition Women in Boston. John Wilshire Carrera, who's one of the managing attorneys at the GBLS Immigration Unit. And Sarah Ignatius, who is the director of the Political Asylum and Immigration Representation Project.
And the title of the roundtable
it's the politics of asylum and adjudication. So we're going to be taking the issues that Carlos has been talking about here and putting them in comparative perspective, looking at Central American claims, Haitian claims, other claims that historically not had a hard time within the framework of asylum and had very low grant rates.
And that'll be here in this room at Wednesday at noon. And then in addition, we have a few slots still available for people who want to have one-on-one or small group time with Carlos to talk about his work. So you can sign up with Jim Galligan. Send me an email to me, call by the office, and we're happy to sign up for the talk.
Wednesday's panel's in 2:20.
What?
Wednesday's panel's in 2:20.
Oh, is it 2:20? Thank you. I thought it was 2:30. Okay, is it 2:20? Okay, so open for questions. Don't be shy. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. I was just wondering, you were speaking about encouraging folks to speak up to sort of lay a basis for a political opinion claim once they're already in the United States. Do you feel like you have to balance that against a fear of they lose their claim and are deported, how that impacts their safety once they return to Mexico?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a real concern. It's their decision. It really is, and it's a catch-22, and that's what makes it so difficult. Because I tell them off the bat, we're playing for all the marbles. This is it. Because if they say I can't go back, there's no way. I said the only way you're going to have a culpable claim is this. The bottom line is that even if they don't have so long as it's not frivolous. If you file a claim, sometimes it takes 3, 4, 5 years, and that can save a life. So publicly, I can't counsel you or anybody else to engage in unethical, dilatory tactics. But if it's a colorable claim, then why not pursue it? If you're going to save a life. But if you're playing for all the marbles and you're pissed off, why not criticize the government? This makes it much more, and the other thing I failed to mention is that we have, of the pro bono groups, actually the most important thing I failed to mention, of the pro bono groups, we formed a group called Mexicanos en Exilio. And to be on the board, you got to be pursued by the government, you have to be seeking asylum. And once they do that, they're all here lawfully. And the other thing we're doing with them is each one of them will serve as witnesses in the cases of the others. because the immigration judges poo-poo academicians and say, well, what do you know about torture? Well, the clients can say, well, you see the scar here, and see the cut in my throat, and you see the 5 death certificates of my family. Of course, expert witnesses are very important, but it's their decision, and most of them, that it's so horrible that most of them that come seeking asylum have already lost a child or a parent.
Thank you so much for your presentation. You briefly mentioned the transition to the oral argument system, and that's part of a wholesale criminal justice and civil justice reform in Mexico. And I was hoping that you could comment on whether or not you see that having a positive impact on transparency and accountability, specifically within the government, and also, if I suspect your answer is going to be that it may not be very effective, what do you see as possibly being, a step in a positive direction in terms of legal reforms or other kinds of interventions?
Part of that would be a jury system. That just increases the ability to threaten 12 other people. Like the old mobsters, all you need is one. It's just you're transplanting, and that's kind of why it may have not been clear, but that's why I went through the legal colonial legacy, is that this is Roman rule vis-a-vis a common law tradition that's for us it's inherent, it's in our DNA. And then to transpose that to the Mexican context is just, I think unworkable at this point. It's got to be framed and modified within the context of their legacy. But there have been gradual movements. But at this point, the problem is one of the absence of a professional civil servant class. And I think part of the legacy is that if you're a cop or the military, it follows the mentality of the conquistadores. It's your right to pillage. It's a benefit of the job to rob and bribe and be corrupt. That's part of the package. And it's so ingrained that, absent the professionalization of that bureaucracy, I don't see how we can do it superficially at the top. Yes.
I recently read that there's an attorney, a Mexican attorney, I think his name is Sandoval, and he is bringing a case to the International Criminal Court where he wants to prosecute the president of Mexico for the death of the cops that are all connected to the war on drugs. I was just wondering if any of your clients have been contacted, or any, because I'm imagining that there's going to be a wholesale, tons of people testimonies and things like that. I'm just wondering if that's now affected the asylum community.
Well, that's interesting. In the case of Emilio Gutierrez Soto, we have, in conjunction with the organization that Stephanie was with in El Paso, filed a complaint with the Inter-American Court, basically for the same reasons, but more focused on the fact that all these, the Mexican government investigates itself when you allege civilian complaints. And that's against the Mexican Constitution, against the Mexican law. And that's been one of the biggest problems and battles in Mexico, is that we want an independent investigation by civilian authorities of military abuses. And so most of the time that we go into, or I've seen people, and when we've decided to go into the Inter-American Courts, it's an international forum for political purposes because the enforcement mechanisms aren't there to compel them. Yes.
It seems like it is the fact that drugs and drug warrant are closely entangled with your work. I'm wondering if you have a perspective or opinion on what the policy should be for the U.S. and also for Mexico on drug policy. It just seems so pervasive in Mexico. How do you have a clean house? And I don't know, I guess, do you have any insight into
I mean, one of the major movements is of course withdrawing the supply, limiting the supply here. I mean, these are long-term goals over a 20-25 year span, which involves limiting the demand in the U.S. because this is the Mexican position. It's the U.S. fault because you guys are snorting all the coke. You guys are the ones who are doing it on one level. On the other level is legalize at least marijuana, and that would reduce it. But at this point, the real problem, we're dealing with a lot of the problems, and the solutions are long-term and pervasive. Because really the worst thing you could do right now is to stop the drug trade, because Mexican society would fall apart. I mean, all the businesses that are opening up in El Paso, all the businesses that are leaving Juarez, everything that's sustaining Juarez are drug money.
Along similar lines, you talked about like this sort of government's insinuation that a lot of these people have been involved in the drug trade, and then like looking at the United States policy towards drugs, have you seen if those insinuations have led to discretionary denials of asylum at all, just because the Mexican government says this person is involved in drugs, and then immigration judges say that I'm going to deny you asylum on basically discretionary grounds?
Well, yes, but it's not uttered. When you get to know your judges, they're sophisticated enough not to put certain things on the record. But part of the reality, I think, of practicing law is that 90% of the prosecutors or the judges are prosecutors. And 90% of the judges have worked with the prosecutors. We have situations where the prosecutors are ex-supervisors of the judge. And so there's this incestuous relationship where they are all reading the same tea leaves. And they'll allow the introduction of certain information like that that's irrelevant. And they won't cite it in their decisions, but it clearly colors their decision. Because discretion is a big part of administrative law, but you can't abuse the discretion. And they're sophisticated enough not to say it or not to point to it. But we've had several cases where that's a factor, where that's more of a factor is in the Convention Against Torture. The Convention Against Torture is an alternative form of relief that deals with individuals who are barred from asylum because of their conviction of a particular serious crime, which is almost any aggravated felony. But we see those in informant cases, and informants who have been spilling their guts out to the U.S. government. Ultimately, or they attempt to deport them, and their previous involvement. Because with the Convention Against Torture, all you have to show is that there's a likelihood that you're going to be tortured by the government upon your return. So if you've been squealing on the government, and there's a likelihood that they'll find out, then you would be granted. But I've seen cases that are very strong where it's precisely because they're drug traffickers that they will deny it without framing it that way.
Mine was sort of similar to David's, but given the highly politicized nature of asylum law, I'm wondering if you can comment on how you see the high denial rate as reflective of the fact that the U.S. that Mexico is a strategic partner with the U.S. in the war on drugs, and how those are connected.
Yeah, that's an ongoing debate. I've been very critical of that, and I have enough of a respectful relationship with the immigration judges where they'll personally criticize me and say, that's not true, that we don't, the Board of Immigration Appeals or EOIR in D.C. doesn't tell us what to say or do. And my response is that you're still governed, you're still a product. If I, as a defense attorney, became a judge, I'd be colored by my history, as all of you would be. but their history is 90% prosecutors. They all get the memo. And the memo, essentially, in terms of the policy, is the State Department reports on human rights. If you read the State Department reports, which is the most important document that the government relies on, but the case law says you're not limited to that, and you can't give that more weight than anything else. But what the judges do is that they'll look at the State Department report, and the State Department report reflects the diplomatic relationships with the various countries. And if you look at the State Department report on Mexico, it's critical, but it doesn't reflect what's happening. So, they've got their bases covered in that sense, where they don't tell us what to do, but we're relying on what they say.
I was intrigued by your statistics on the gender breakdown, or the victims of murder are overwhelmingly male, but the seekers of justice on behalf of murdered relatives are overwhelmingly female. And I'm just wondering if what the gender breakdown is in your clients, or if you know is statistically in terms of grant rates or anything, because overall the majority of asylum of cases that are granted are male. And you realize that, some of the issues come up with domestic violence or other claims that have a hard time fitting into the framework, but I'm curious how gender plays out in your cases.
50-50. It's about, it's been interesting in the sense that probably 50-50 in the sense that I'd make a distinction between the applicant and the murdered family member. Because in a lot of these instances, the victim, it was a woman. And so that's like maybe 30%. And then on the other ones is the ones who lead the charge over here in the cases of women. Cipriana Jurado, Monica, family members. So it's pretty equal.
Are those easier? Do they kind of push you more into the realm of political opinion when you have the female justice seeker versus the male who's been threatened with harm, and where that's kind of more clearly an extortion question? Is there any differences to the cases? We've been trying to, and we can be a lot more specific tomorrow or in the class, is matter of Acosta. Is the classic social group case dealing with taxi drivers who are being extorted in El Salvador. The BIA comes back and says that's not a social group to be extorted per se. But we've had individuals who are extorted and complain about it. And so we piggyback on the political opinion. But we're also framing it as part of a social group. And that's where, when I encourage them to speak out, say you don't have to, but if you're angry and you want to protest, you can do it here in El Paso. And we've been criticized by that, but nobody can cite any case law or ethical rule that prohibits us from advising our clients that the First Amendment exists.
Who is Sean Huckabee?
Yeah, I had the slide, but this is another twist. We've gotten to the point where the Mexican government can define voting rights in the United States. The Mexican military. Sean Huckabee, during this whole process as well, is a U.S. citizen from El Paso, 20 years old or so, who 2009 went to get a truck fixed with his friend Carlos Quijas, Mexican-American, both citizens. And on the way back, the Mexican government planted marijuana in their car and arrested them. And ultimately, they end up in jail, one in Las Islas Marias, which is like Papillon's prison, if you've ever seen the movie. And the other one, Sean Huckabee, was in the state prison in Juarez for over a year, and he was beaten and tortured by the military to confess. Okay, so his father goes on this international campaign to get his son released. And ultimately, pursuant to the treaty, the exchange prisoner treaty that we have with Mexico, he's released a couple of months ago. And when he's released to go into La Tuna Federal Prison in El Paso. And he's paroled. And when he's paroled, there's a finding. Well, during the sentencing, the federal sentencing, pursuant to the federal sentencing guidelines, they found that because he was tortured by the Mexican military, this is the U.S. government talking, because he was tortured by the U.S. military, that they were going to reduce his sentence, because generally you have to come back to a comparable crime and do a comparable sentence. And he had like a year or two left, and they let him out after like 2 months. So Sean Huckabee, in fact, they came to the office and we're going to represent them, wants a presidential pardon for that drug trafficking offense because he can't vote. And he's suffered certain civil disabilities. So I think, we've got, and he's one of many Americans who's caught up in this, where they were planting drugs, probably trying to make Americans look bad in terms of the dictate that it's these U.S. citizens who are using drugs, and they're part of the problem. But the guy was clean as a whistle. We weren't involved in it initially, but ultimately, there was findings by the defense attorneys and others that he had been tortured. So essentially, we want a resolution from Congress, and we want a presidential pardon, basically prohibiting the Mexican army from defining who can vote in elections here. That's how we're framing it.
Well, thank you very much, Carl.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.